See about doing the same for all the others. General approach, did everyone land on basically using document create element UL to create the list, document.create element LI for each of the list items, UL unordered list, LI list item, and then this stuff could be the text content of each LI until you get down here, right? Because that's not text, that's a whole div. So we're going to have to do that a little differently. So let's get to work. Just as I made render color, let's make one called render list item. Function render list item. What do we need to know to create each of those? We need to know the name of the field and its value at a minimum. So that's what I'm going to do for each individual one. Just say field name, value. All this is doing is creating the LI. Don't worry about where exactly it's getting called yet. Let's just make it so that it can create an LI because we know we can do much. That's pretty simple. Let's not worry about how field name and value you can get in there. It's document.create element, the string LI. Need to save that to something. Const LI equals that. Or const item if you prefer. Li dot text content equal. I'm going to make a template. Let's put the field name in there. Colon space the value. Knowing that right now the color div isn't really going to work. And then don't forget to return it. So let's refresh the page and see if that function works in isolation. Let's just go to the console and try doing something. Let's try render list item. First argument is the field name. Say dog breed. Second argument is the value. Let's say corgi. And it gives me back li dog breed colon corgi. So that works. That method or function rather by itself works. Test that in isolation before we go trying to do too much at once. Piece of cake. Now each of these isn't so terribly long, but if they were all inside handle submit would get pretty dang long pretty fast, and it would be harder to track down each individual piece of functionality. So I'm trying to have each function kind of do as little as possible. Each of them do a discrete task that I could assign a verb to, like render color, render list item. All right, so now we need to call render list item over and over for each one of these. And they're all going to end up in a list. So we need to make that list. Be super cool if we could eventually get to the point where we have render list. And I don't know, it's going to need a bunch of data. You could call it data. You could call it person data, whatever. How about person data? Let's make const ul or list, whatever you want to call it, equals document.create element ul. And then somehow I want to loop over this person data and call render list item over and over. But I don't know how to do that yet. Do something. And then eventually we'll return the list. So how can we get all the appropriate data? We could pass the form in there. I kind of like the idea of being able to just render this list based on some sort of data object instead of that has nothing to do with the DOM. So let's see if we can build an object like that. You've all learned about objects by now. They look something like this. So let's just make, again, let's test this in isolation. So let's say const person equals some object. Objects, object literals, we know are denoted by curly brace, right? Is this news to anyone? Anybody not get that far with the Code Wars stuff? And then inside there, we have a bunch of properties and their values. So keys and values, really. So let's say name. Read. Favorite color. Our beloved cornflower blue. Age. 43. He will be someday. And here's something interesting to note about object literals. You can put a comma after the last item, and that is totally allowed. Now, why would you want to do that? You might think that looks ghastly. Here's two advantages to doing that. Number one, you come back and add another property, you're not going to forget to add the comma because it's already there. Just get in the habit of always putting the comma. Another one, we saw how git diff works. Remember, git, each time you make a commit, just stores the difference between that and the previous commit. So if you didn't have the comma there already and you add it, then that's going to be an extra line in your commit, which, besides being inefficient, also makes it harder for someone to read the diff to retrace your steps. So it's not a bad habit to get into to just leave the trailing comma and then just train yourself not to be grossed out by it, a comma with nothing after it. All right, so now we have some object with some data in it. If we could get an object that looks like this, then maybe we could call render list. So let's just pretend it already works and call render list person. And I guess let's just try details dot append child, the result of render list, because it should return a list. Just comment this out for right now. Now, how can we make it do that? So inside here, we've got this object that looks like this. And then for each field inside there, we want to do something. You probably had to do something like this on the mirror object problem on Code Wars, right? Who remembers how to do this? If I remember how to, basically we want to loop over each of these things in this object so that we can create a list item out of each pair of things. Like a for loop. Something like property. Something like a for loop. I hear for each. All right. So for each in JavaScript. Okay. Let's learn another trick then. For each is just too hard. Let's just. Yeah, oh no, it is. Let's do something else. Because I want to show you something else. That's why. All right. So these things, these are the keys, right? The keys in these key value pairs. There's a little something in JavaScript called Object.keys, a built-in function that returns all of the keys from an object as an array. So let's do that with person data. And then we end up with an array containing just name, favorite color, age. So then we could loop over that. And there's another trick we could do too. Instead of a traditional for loop, we could use Array.map. Anybody know map from this or any other language? Everyone was using it on Code Wars. All right, let's say JavaScript Array.map. All right, developer.mozilla.org. Meet MDN. This is, for all intents and purposes, the official documentation of JavaScript and the DOM. The map method creates a new array with the results of calling a provided function on every element in this array. Kind of a confusing definition. Two parts to it. First thing to know, it does the same thing to every element in the array. It also happens to return a new array with the return value of that thing that it did to all of them. But we don't really need that return value. We just want to do the same thing to every array. So we can use it just to do that much, even if we don't care about the fact that it happens to return another array. So Object.keys is our array. We know that it looks something like this. Name, favorite color, age. So let's call map on that. And the argument to map is a function. We could write this function as a separate named function, or we can make an anonymous function right here in line. This time we're going to do that. So we can actually write function parentheses just like this, just leave out the name. You can pass functions around like objects because they are objects. We could have done the same thing inside add event listener. Could have written function parentheses and written some function there. So the documentation tells us, it calls the function there a callback. Function that produces an element of the new array, taking 3 arguments. First one, current value. In other words, this function is going to receive as its first argument the current item in the array. So that's the field name, right? That's name or favorite color or age. First time through, it's going to be name. Second time through, it's going to be favorite color, etc. Now it takes a couple of other arguments, but you may remember there's no enforcement of the number of arguments, and we're not going to use those, so we can just leave them out. Because at its simplest, map just does the same thing to every element in the array. So all we really need is the item in the array. So then what are we going to do? For each one, we want to call render list item, right? Render list item takes 2 arguments. First, the field name. But what do you know? That's the item from the array. Second argument to render list item is the value. So how do we get the value inside this function? Given that we have the key, how do we get the value at that location in the object? What was that? Yeah, and I saw Natalie doing this, right? Yeah. So person data is the object in question. Square brackets, field name. Right? So we could say, this is junk, you don't need to write this down. We could say person data dot name, right? Or person data, the string name, same exact thing. The keys are really strings, but if you happen to name those keys according to the rules for naming variables, then you can use dot syntax. In other words, they don't have spaces in them, they don't have dashes in them or anything like that. If the name of that property is a valid JavaScript name, then you can use the dot syntax. But that assumes you know the exact name of that key. If it's in a variable, you would have to use the square brackets, but you always could. So it's kind of like, if anyone knows PHP, an associative array in PHP, kind of like a map in some languages or a hash in others. All right, so what do we want to do with this list item now that we've got it? We want to append it to this list, right? So list.append child li. If you wanted to one-line this, you could. List.append child, and then this big call to render list. But that's maybe a little bit much for one line. Yes, I do need the equal sign. Thank you. Put a comment in here. Loop over that array. All right, so map calls a function that we define on every item in the array. And we defined that function right in line as an anonymous function. Does it work? Let's see. Got a favorite color? Blue. Let's say this blue right here. It's a very specific blue. Name read, favorite color, cornflower blue. 43. Because I didn't get it out the form right. I hard-coded this person. So we've got render list working. It does take that data in and give us back a list that we can put on the page. But we don't have it getting it from the form yet, right? We still had to hard code this object. Let's do that next step.